Hey, welcome into the Big Ten Huddle. I'm your host, JR, and I forgot my light there for a second, so I turned it on right at the last second. Exciting episode for you with Big Ten After Dark, our basketball episode that we try to do every night. Sometimes don't always get to it, but we try to do it every single night. We have Jason Carmelo from Big Underdog. He does bracketology, also writes for Bracket Busters. He does a very good job. We had Jason on last time, so we're really excited to have Jason here again. Jason, why don't you introduce yourself and tell people where they can find your work at?
Yeah, hey everybody. Thanks for having me. Jason Carmelo. You can find my work at Big Underdog, and then also write for Busting Brackets. I do a lot of bracketology for them. So it's big time of year.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. This is when all the bracketologists come out, and we all, yearn for everything you have to say. So we
That's
love
right.
it.
That's right.
And I've gone ahead and put the Big Underdog website there in the chat as well. You can go ahead, click on that, and go check anything out that Jason's got going on over there. Does a really good job, and I just really appreciate Jason coming in here and talking to us. But before we get into that, we do need to talk about this Michigan Nebraska game a little bit because this was a crazy one, and this was one that had some NCAA tournament, stuff to it that for Nebraska and if they could possibly get in. And John, I see what you said here. He said this game is 2019 Indiana Purdue levels of bad. Final score 48-46. Pretty close. 49-46 is the end of the game. Michigan takes down Nebraska. Jason, I mean, if you want to talk about a gritty, grinded out game, that's what this game was. It was grinded out, gritty. Vlad Golden gets hit in the face. Yeah, Danny Wolf is holding his head for basically an entire possession one time, and Nebraska's getting beat up. I think Connor Essegian was kind of getting ragdolled there for a little bit. It just that's what the game was, and that's Big Ten basketball for you. What were your thoughts on the game?
Yeah, really physical. Michigan has kind of adapted that physicality, right? They built their team around their bigs with Wolf and Golden, and they're starting to get better play from Gale from the perimeter. But by and large, they've been carried by their big guys, so they're fine. Getting in a cage match. For Nebraska, if you're a Nebraska fan out there, you might be frustrated. Played pretty well. You might be frustrated. I have good news for you. Your schedule is very favorable. You're gonna make tournament. So you can be frustrated right now, but the reality is where the bubble is right now and where you're sitting at. You still have Minnesota at home and Iowa at home. A trip to Ohio State, which is to be honest, has been not an intimidating place for visitors this year. They've lost 5 league games at home already. So with that said, if they just take care of business and win Minnesota and Iowa at home, they're gonna make tournament.
Yeah, no, I think you're, I agree with you. ESPN has been really high in Nebraska for the past couple weeks now, and I think at one point they kind of had Ohio State and Nebraska right in line with each other, and then after Ohio State had their loss to Northwestern, Nebraska just shot right up. Even
Yeah.
though Nebraska lost that game to Penn State, they still were up ahead of them. But I do want to touch on Michigan a little bit in this game because we talked about the physicality of the Big Ten and stuff like that. I mean, I was somebody that said about this Michigan team early on, I said, they just don't look, as physical as
Yeah.
maybe a Dusty May team I think would look in the out of conference. And so I said, when you get into the Big Ten, that to me is going to be one of the biggest tests of Dusty May, him coaching this team is can he get this team to play physical enough in the Big Ten? And really, other than maybe one or two games, I'd say the Michigan State game, maybe Michigan State was more physical in that one. And this game was a huge test to see Michigan is a physical team and they are going to be a gritty, grinded out team. They might get knocked in the mouth. They might be, get a rebound over them or something like that, but they're going to respond. And they did in this game when the 3-point shooting wasn't there, when it felt like you had to grind it out, be gritty. Michigan did that. And I think it's just credit to Dusty May, right? How good of a coach he is,
Yeah.
how much he can get his guys to buy in. I mean, Jason, what's your thoughts on this development of this Michigan team? I mean, last year only 8 wins, obviously coaching changed and everything, but I mean, to go from 8 wins to now what a possible 4-3 seed for
Yeah.
Michigan, that's just crazy.
Yeah, I think they can get up to a 3. There's probably a path to a 2 seed for Michigan.
Wow.
Right now they're sitting in right about with Wisconsin at the 3 line. If you can take Florida, if you take Florida Atlantic to a Final Four, you can coach, right? I mean, Dusty May is
Hmm.
a phenomenal coach. I wrote about it previously. I thought he was the best hire of the sequence. They tried to get him in Columbus, they couldn't quite get him, and so he had some. He's very close with Chris Holtman. He had some conversations with Holtman, and I think Chris kind of steered them to the other side of the state line. You could tell early in the season they were trying to find themselves, right? They played Wake Forest, and Wake Forest is not an overly physical team, but Wake Forest was just too much for them early on in the non-conference. They played, Arkansas at Madison Square Garden, and they just weren't ready to go. Like Calipari's team at that time, that was really all Arkansas had on their resume for a long, long time. I think they got beat by Oklahoma soon after that in Charlotte. What happened was right after that, they took a trip out. I took a trip out west to LA. And, I think teams can do this. It can go well, or it can go sideways. They went out west and they just punched USC and UCLA in the mouth out west. And they spent, 5 or 6 days out there together, and boy, did they play well. And I think once you go out to UCLA and you play a Mick Cronin team and you can kind of wrestle them down to the mat and win, then you've proved something. Their season changed when they went out there in early January and they started playing real well. Since then, they've only lost 3 league games.
I'm muted. I apologize. We talked about it, like, to start the Big Ten season with this Michigan team is how they just turn the ball over so much. You
Yeah.
saw it in that Wisconsin game, you saw it in that Oklahoma game, and they're still turning the ball over a good amount, albeit it's not, 17, 18 times a game like they were at times. But this is still a team that is able to recover from those things. And I think it just speaks to how talented and how overall this team is really able to stay in games, use their talent, use Danny Wolf, use Vlad Golden in special ways. I mean, that pair right there is going to win you a lot of games, and it has. I mean, early on, that game against Wisconsin basically won them the game. I felt like was Danny Wolf and Vlad Golden being able to pair up and do what they were able to do in that game. So
yeah, I mean, JR, you're
okay.
right. I mean, they're 339th in the country in turnover percentage offensively. I mean, that's atrocious. Teams that usually do that do not make the tournament. But what they have is they're the 6th best team in the country at 2-point field goal percentage offensively. So what they do is they get the ball down the block and they can score down low. They're shooting high percentage shots because because if they don't get the ball inside and do that, then they turn it over. And so they have to be very, very simple offensively. The ball goes through Golden, it goes down to the block, and they score from there because their guards just don't take care of the ball. Listen, we saw Gale do that last year at times with Ohio State. He was maddening, right? I mean, he's very skilled, very good offensively, but he can be a bit careless with the ball. And some of their other guards are very, very similar. But when you shoot the ball that well, it can really mask a lot of issues. I will say this. They have to be careful in the tournament, though, right? Tournament, historically, you have to have guards that take care of it. The intensity ramps up. You're going to be playing a lot of really good experienced teams. And you're going to run into issues where late turnovers are going to hurt you. So when you look back at a team, and listen, Michigan's had a great year, but they win a lot of close games because they're very well coached under May. They have to be careful. Their guards have got to take care of the ball a little bit better.
I was going to ask you, can you recall a team that made a deep, and I'll say Sweet 16, Elite 8 type of run, maybe not the deepest, but a Sweet 16, Elite 8 type of run that turns the ball over at the rate that Michigan does? Like, can you remember a team in recent memory? Because I can't think of a team like that. Obviously, turnover rates, we don't know them off the top of our head, but a team that just continually gave the ball away. I can't think of a team like that was able to make it that far in the NCAA tournament recently.
Yeah, in years past, we kind of grouped kind of programs together. Baylor has been very good the last 5 to 6 years, and their turnover rate is higher than you would usually see. It's usually in the 180s or the 200s. So Baylor, but they would overcome all of that with athleticism. So Baylor is a good model for them. Michigan doesn't have that kind of athleticism. They're kind of plodding and kind of going inside, but it can be done. It can be done, but you got to make shots, right? They're going to have to grind it out defensively a little bit, but they're going to have to shoot at a higher percentage when they play better teams.
Yeah, in this Nebraska game, they shot 5 of 27 from 3 in this one. That's not going to get it done. Danny Wolf was their leading 3-point shooter, 2 for 6 in the game. Pretty much everybody else was either 0 for 1 or 2, and 1 for 4, 1 for 5 in this one. So it is impressive to me Michigan was able to grind it out, but yeah, got to be better than that in the tournament for sure. So, all right. Jason, let's get into some teams' bracketology now. Okay, so Philip is going to start us off with this question. He says, "How much do teams who schedule weak non-conference games get diminished by the selection committee?"
Wow, that's Philip. That's a really good question. So the only difference right now, there's very little difference right now between Nebraska and Ohio State. The major difference is Ohio State scheduled too hard,
Hmm.
and now they're paying for it. Um, Typically, when you zoom out, the NCAA tournament committee says you need to be 4 games over 500 to make the tournament. That's kind of an unwritten rule. So once you go under that threshold in Ohio State, that's the world they live in now. Once you go under that threshold, it's very hard to make the tournament. When you start seeing losses get to the 13s, 14s, that's a lot. Um, in 2022, Michigan made it at 17 and 14, right? Michigan fans, they got it in as an 11 seed. They ended up making a Sweet 16, but that's very, very, very rare. Usually they make you be 4 games over. So you want to find a balance. When you look at teams' non conference strength of schedules, right now, Ohio State's dealing with about a 35. So the truth is, if they swapped out 2 of their games and their non-conference was in the 120s or the 160s, right around where Nebraska is, they'd have 2 more wins and they make the tournament. Nebraska kind of find that sweet spot. They're kind of in the mid 150s, 160s. They got just enough wins that they've got a little bit of wiggle room. Every year you hear people talking about the bubble. Last year, everybody every year says the bubble was bad. That's actually not true at all. Last year the bubble was very good. St. John's under Patino this year would be on the back of the 9 line. Let me say that again. They'd be a 9 seed this year. They didn't make the tournament last year.
Hmm.
So there are significant concerns with some of the back end bubble teams. But even with that said, they're going to make you win a lot of games. So you want to find a spot where, to answer Philip's question, you want to find a spot where your non-conference strength of schedules in the 100s. That's probably just fine. When you start to get in the upper, there's 364 teams. You start to get in the upper 200s of the threes. That's when they can ding you. If you're on the bubble and it starts with a 3 for 300 and some, you do not get the benefit of the doubt. And the reason is the committee says, I need you to schedule people in non-conference to make our sport relevant, right? So
Right.
it's a way to keep the sport healthy in November and December. So most Big Ten teams take care of that, no problem. We saw that, and there was a big argument last year with the Big 12 schools, Texas Tech and multiple Big 12 schools scheduled TCU. They all scheduled in the 300s because they said, I don't want to take on the losses. They did the math. I don't want more than 13 losses heading into my conference tournament because I can't make it, right? And you're going to absorb 10 or 11 in the league. You're going to see Big Ten teams doing that. You're going to see SEC teams doing that because there's so much parity in the leagues. It's hard to go over 500 and still make the tournament. Your conference record has nothing to do with it, but it's the amount of losses you're absorbing. That's Ohio State's problem. Next year, Diebler will not schedule that. They can't. They can't take on that many losses in the non-con.
Yeah, they had a ton of conference games or non-conference games that were really, really difficult for them. I mean, they played Texas that very first game, which I was kind of
Yep.
like, why? You know, like why do you play that first game out of the gate? You're a brand new coach, a bunch of transfers in, but I mean, obviously they were trying to make a name for themselves early, and then you get Texas A&M, Pitt, Kentucky. Kentucky worked out for them. Auburn, you know, there were a lot of really difficult teams there for them to play. I do think this conversation also kind of goes into a little bit of Illinois, which I know that's the team that Philip is a fan of, so that's kind of where he's getting at a little bit.
Yeah.
Illinois fans are concerned with the rest of their schedule right now because they have Iowa, Michigan, and Purdue to end the season. Now, Iowa, you know, they should beat Iowa. They get them at home, but this is still Iowa, a team that can get hot from three, that can kind of go crazy offensively and just kind of outscore you sometimes, even without an Owen Freeman on their roster right now. And so if they do lose, you know, say worst case scenario, if Illinois does lose these next 3 games and they go 17 and 14, that's less than 4 wins. I mean, are
Yeah.
we looking at a scenario here where Illinois could be on the bubble and possibly not making it?
So what makes Illinois is there a scenario? Yes. But it's really simple. If you're an Illini fan and you're listening, if you beat Iowa at home, you make the tournament. That's it. That's it. You're in the tournament. I would suggest you don't lose out and then lose in the first round, but we're gonna let's do some quick math here. So Illinois already has banked 6 quadrant 1 wins. So for those listening, quadrant 1 are the best wins you can have, then quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and then quadrant 4. They have 6 quadrant 1 wins. Just to give you an idea, the snapshot of the bubble last year, or excuse me, last week at this time, right? So numbers change, but just to give you an idea of where the bubble was at this time last week, the 6 teams in the bracket matrix that have participated in, the 6 teams that were on the outside looking in: Georgia, SMU, Xavier, North Carolina, Cincy, and Indiana, right? Those teams. Let me go through the quad 1 wins. Georgia was 2-10, SMU 0-4, Xavier 1-9, Carolina 1-10, Cincy 1-8, and Indiana at the time was 2-11. That's 7 of 52. That's 13% winning percentage in quad 1 games. 7 for 6 teams. Well, Illinois got 6 by themselves. They're going to make tournament. There just isn't enough strength on the bubble. They're going to be okay. They've been injured. The committee's going to look and say they're really talented. They've been injured. They've been banged up. They've been sick. Underwood made a big deal about them being sick. I think he got that out there just to make sure. I think Illinois is fine. If you go 17-14 and lose in the first game of the Big Ten tournament, which is possible, that's not a good look. That's 17-15. That's really pushing it, like we talked about. But all that is a moot point if they just beat Iowa at home. So that's the game. They can lose the other games and still get in. Their seed may suffer a little bit. They'd be a heck of a 10 seed. And a 2 seed could look at them in the second round and have major issues with them because of their talent level, and they can really score. But they're okay. They just got to beat Iowa.
That's really interesting because we're just talking about Ohio State earlier, and I didn't realize there were so many comparisons between Ohio State and Illinois. But as we talk about it more, Ohio State right now has banked 5 quad 1 wins. But of course, on top of that, they've also gone 3-4 against quad 2 teams, and Illinois has only gone 5-1. So how much do those quad 2 losses matter, to the committee? Where you have a losing record in the quad 1, a losing record in the quad 2 for Ohio State. Like, is that something that makes that big of a difference, or what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's the home. It's really for Ohio State. Truly, it's the total number of losses, because if you winning at Purdue is like 3 wins. Winning against a Kentucky team is fantastic this year. In a neutral court, that's like 2 extra wins. A Maryland team, really good win. A neutral court Texas, who's a bubble team. So it's not the quality of wins. And because of those, they can absorb quad 2 losses. They didn't do anything silly in the non-con and lose to anybody in the quad 3 or quad 4. It is simply the backwards math of they just can't get to that line of 4 games over 500. Usually to make the tournament, you need to be over 500 if you're bubble team, over 500 in quads 1 plus 2. But again, because of their just strength of some of the big time wins and the bubble being really weak, they can absorb those quad 2 losses, which some years you're not able to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. EA has a good question here, and everybody, if you're in the chat, please feel free to send questions in to Jason about your teams. If it's obviously we're more of a Big Ten channel, so that's kind of what we're focusing on. But even if you're somebody from another conference that you want to know about a different team, Jason's here to answer those as well. If not, we'll just kind of keep going through Big Ten teams. EA is asking here about the top team ranked in the Big Ten right now, according to Net, that being Maryland. He said, how high of a seed can Maryland get if they win out the regular season with potentially 3 more quad 1 wins? What's your thoughts there, Jason?
Yeah, I when I look at Maryland, I've wrote about this a little bit. When I look at Maryland and I think of the team that is kind of the most qualified and kind of the most talented to make a run in March, that's in the Big Ten. That's Maryland. They've got youth. They have athleticism. They have experience. They got some really tough players. And they got kind of a mix of everything you need. And Willard's a good coach as well. To answer the question succinctly, I think there's a path to the top of the 3 line for Maryland. It's going to get a little bit tough to get in that 2 line because you got all those SEC schools just stacking wins, and the losses really won't hurt them. A team like, can they get ahead of a Wisconsin? Maybe, right? Or a Michigan? Maybe they go to Michigan. Houston and Tennessee or Florida, right? 2 of those teams are taking 2 of the 2 seeds. So it's just hard to get that much traffic. I think a Big Ten team is going to get in on the 2 line. The league's too good. So one of the Big Ten teams is going to get in the 2 line. And then can you beat out an Iowa State, a Texas A&M, a Kentucky? Like, can you get ahead of those teams? I think just kind of very succinctly, 3 line would be there's a path to it at the 3 line from Maryland. They didn't schedule. That's another scenario. They just didn't schedule the way that some of these other teams did, and that's where you get dinged. Maryland's non-conference strength of schedule was 325. So when you talk about that versus a Texas A&M team whose was 34, right, or a Purdue's team that was 9, even Michigan State at 145, Maryland's is double that or triple. So they're not going to get the benefit of the doubt because they just didn't do enough in the non-con to kind of get into that higher echelon SEC 2 seed. So we'll go with a 3 seed. But listen, the reality is once you get in that seed, between the 2, 3, 4, it doesn't. The winning percentages in March aren't that different when you get the 2, 3, 4. Once you get to the 5 line, it's completely different. So I think Maryland, of all the teams, they could be the team people look back and like, whoa, they made the Final Four. I thought Michigan State or I thought Purdue. I think Maryland might be the most talented team. They have the least amount of deficiencies. Like when you look at the metrics, Purdue's fantastic, right? Matt Painter is. You spend time with around the Big Ten. Matt Painter is the most engaging, gets it. Like he's fantastic, and he's willing this team to a really good spot. The reality is they don't guard. They've really struggled guarding, but Maryland doesn't have those types of kind of glaring deficiencies. Michigan turns the ball over. Purdue struggles to guard. Michigan State can't shoot from the perimeter very well. Right? They're all wonderful teams, but they have major deficiencies. Maryland doesn't have those.
Yeah, I said it last game that Michigan State won. I said if you're going to get a Michigan State team that can shoot 40% from 3 in a game,
oh yeah,
I mean this is an Elite 8 Final Four team if they get the right matchups. But unfortunately, they just haven't done that consistently. They've done it recently, but they haven't done it consistently all season. So we'll see if they can do it. All right, so I guess we are kind of getting into this discussion a little bit by talking about Maryland, and you brought up Purdue and Michigan State. Like, who do you see as the favorite to be the team in the Big Ten that gets the highest seed line? Right now, who do you think that team is looking like it is, and maybe who are another 1 or 2 options that could surpass them?
Yeah, right now I have Michigan State ahead of everybody, just barely. Wisconsin, Michigan. I mean, you could make an argument either way. Michigan State does have to go to Maryland. That's going to be a tough game. But then Wisconsin is at home, Michigan's at home, and Iowa. So you get kind of those late, really quality wins and get settled in the bracket in the regular season. The committee's been very straightforward in a sense of once the regular season ends and then they go into kind of conference tournament mode, your wins and losses in the conference tournament are not weighted the same. Like what I'm saying is there's no full credit one way or the other. Everything is pretty much baked in. There's a couple things that move late, but you got to understand the swings and the fans and the tweets and all these things that happen when you hear, oh, they need this win to get in or this loss takes them out. The reality is this. They've been playing at that time about 35 games. That's only 1 of 35. And to be honest, the committee, by the time you get into Friday, guess what? The committee's already voted. They've already voted in. Or there's very few things changing. The teams have already been selected at that point. Now, the back end of the bubble theoretically hasn't, but a lot of teams have already been selected. I'd probably rank them now in terms of how they'll end up getting seeded. I'd probably go Michigan State, Michigan, Purdue, Maryland. I'd probably kind of go in that order. It could kind of fluctuate a little bit. I think, Michigan obviously is doing a really good job. Wisconsin is kind of right in the mix as well. Wisconsin's got a really nice resume, but we'll go Michigan State because I think their home wins over Wisconsin and Michigan are going to kind of keep them on the back end of the 2 or the front of the 3 and keep them the highest.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think Michigan State has shown most of the season that they're just consistently going to do what they do well, and I think that adds to something there. Let's talk about the Oregon Ducks here for a second. So the Oregon Ducks, they have the most quad 1 wins of anybody in the Big Ten, but they also went on that terrible losing streak, and now they're on a 4-game losing streak after beating Wisconsin. So I have a hard time figuring out this Ducks team, but they had a really good out of conference. Conference play has been hurting them. What are your thoughts on Oregon, maybe seed line, what they're looking at, and maybe what can they do to earn back some of that respect that they lost a little bit in the big long losing streak they had?
Dana Altman's fantastic. He's a really good basketball coach. When you go to media days and things like that, and you listen to him coach, he just wants to coach ball. Like he just wants to coach it. you've seen a lot of Oregon teams in the past, in the Pac-12, right, that have had average regular seasons and won the Pac-12 tournament. They did it last year. They've gotten better. His teams always get better. So it's a bit surprising, like you said, they jumped out of the gate and they had the most quadrant one wins through, you know, the non-conference of anybody in the country outside of Auburn. Doesn't count because they're that good.
Yeah.
Outside of Auburn. And so they were fantastic. And then they got into the issue of at times they fell in love with the 3-point line, and they just started getting into these games where they just weren't getting easy baskets. They weren't getting out in transition. They kind of got away from their bread and butter. You also have to realize some of these teams, they're like, when you make trips to the East Coast and come back and you got to go to Michigan and Michigan State, that's a tough week. And then you come home and you got UCLA bearing down on you. So that's hard. I also say this, teams have to be careful with their home court advantage. Like you watch the Oregon game and the arena is fairly new. It is not the atmosphere that it was a handful of years ago. So Oregon this year has been better there statistically, kind of from a metric standpoint. They've been better on the road or neutral court than at home. They haven't played very well at home. I mean, I think Illinois is still scoring against them from the game, I think in January. So they've really struggled at home. They haven't had the atmosphere in the home court that they probably deserve, and they've had a wonderful year. Altman's teams always get better. They're getting back to getting Shilstead and some of these really good players attacking the rim. But I think Oregon's really good. I've got them around that 5 seed line. There's probably a path to even then getting a 4 because they have the second most quad one wins in the country. They're back to kind of that status behind Oregon. So they're a dangerous team because they're well coached. They don't have, a bit like Maryland, they're not as kind of skilled, but they do have some pretty good perimeter play, and they don't really have a lot of deficiencies. They're just kind of pretty good at everything, and that plays.
Yeah, I was really impressed with them last game, the way that TJ Bomba was able to shut down John Tonji. And you've seen this Oregon team kind of struggle with defense and struggle with just making smart basketball decisions on the offensive end. But you're exactly right. They've gotten better as things have gone on. I think they just had to catch their breath for a minute, and play some teams that could, they could get their feet under them a little bit more. And I think that Iowa win was a huge confidence builder for them, because I don't know if I would have saw Oregon come back in that game at all,
Well, JR, you hear Cronin, right, complain about traveling back and forth. Well, first of all, he's, respect, he's a wonderful coach, but like they scheduled games in New York, like the Big Ten and the non-conference, like they scheduled those, not the Big Ten.
Right.
So, Musselman, you're hearing now coaches to get on the West Coast at the breaking point of like, I'm tired of going back and forth. Altman doesn't talk, so he just coaches. So you don't hear that. So you never heard the griping of how hard it was to go to Minnesota and then back for a couple games and then back to Michigan. Like you just don't hear that. And it's hard. It's hard on these kids. And because Altman just kind of sticks to the grind, you kind of we didn't really pick up on that's part of the issue.
Right. Yeah, you're exactly right. I do enjoy Mick Cronin and Brad Underwood in their press conferences because it gives me something to talk about. But you're exactly right. Dana Altman just sticks to the grind, and I think every coach approaches it differently, and it's kind of intriguing how they all approach it. Harpoon Bakery is asking here. He says, "I'm hearing Indiana needs to win all 4 remaining conference games. Those 4 games, I believe, are Penn State, at Washington, at Oregon, and Ohio State." So he thinks that they need to win all 4 of those, and 2 quad one games in the Big Ten tournament, which means they might have to win 4 Big Ten tourney games. I got to tell you, that sounds like quite the goal there for them to have to make the Big Ten tournament. They seem closer than that to me. Jason, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think that I don't think they have to do that much damage. As of now, I've got them as the last team or just about the last team in the tournament. They probably can absorb one more loss. It just depends. It depends on, if Ohio State can pick up a win or 2 along the way, the intensity that Ohio State would bring on the final day on senior day to Indiana. But I don't think that they're going to have to win out. They probably can absorb, which is crazy to say, they can probably absorb one more loss. Keep in mind, when you're a fan of a team, nothing happens in isolation, right? So, for example, Wake Forest the other day, getting beat in the ACC, or Oklahoma somehow hanging on to beat Mississippi State. All those things impact everything else. And so nothing happens in isolation. I think Indiana has a leg up because they just have a slightly better record. They won at Ohio State. It's a slightly better record than some of the other teams. I think could probably absorb one loss and still get in. They, like looking at the schedule, they got to beat Penn State at home. They're going to have to beat Washington. They can absorb an Oregon loss on the road, and they got to beat Ohio State at home. 3 out of 4, they're going to make tournament.
Yeah, and then like you said earlier, those Big Ten conference game, tournament games are so interesting. It seems like they've weighted those less and less,
Yeah.
kind of throughout the years. It really seems like they focus so much on the regular season. And I don't know if that's because they do that across the board, or do you think? I mean, you talked about Friday. Like, do you think Big Ten tournament is just so late? I mean, it's literally the latest playing game. They play that championship game right up until the selection show and everything. Like, do you think the Big Ten needs to reconsider where that's at, or do you're seeing this across college football, or
Should
college basketball?
Yeah, should they? Yes, but that's the TV money spot right before a
Yeah,
selection show, so that's not going anywhere.
yeah,
The Sunday games are a throwaway. They have to do the A10 game on a Sunday if Richmond wins and you got to move things around to put a team in. They have to have a contingency bracket there. But if the teams are set, they're seeded. Like it's done.
yeah.
So whoever wins the game, it doesn't move one way or the other, which is kind of incredible. But that's the way that is. They got to get their homework and turn it in so it can be announced, which is kind of a crazy thing. The games just aren't weighted as high. And that's why if you're Indiana, just take care of business and, get to 19-12, whatever that, right around that number, you can absorb a loss as long as it's not a ridiculous one, which you're probably in that. Indiana's probably going to be in that 8-9 game, or, maybe work your way to a 7-10 game and probably be okay. So I think Indiana, you got to beat Penn State. It'll be a bumpy game at Washington, right? It just won't be easy. That's the game. Like that's the game they got to win. Because you get, you might get your 2 home games. You don't have to win at Oregon, but you're going to have to beat Washington on the road. So if you lose that game, then everything's out of whack and you probably won't get in. So, stay up that night, be ready to go. That's the game you got to win.
Yeah, Ohio State's playing USC on I think it's Wednesday night
Yep.
at like 10:30, and I'm like, do I want to do a Big Ten after dark at 12:30 in the morning? What do I do there? But
I'll be up pacing watching that one. So
right, yeah. So that's a conversation for another time. But EA does ask a good question. He says,
yeah.
how many teams in the Big Ten get in? I've seen
right.
that obviously the SEC is going to get the most. 13, 14 teams probably is what it's looking at. I've seen some people say 9. I've seen some people say up to 11 possibly for the Big Ten. Where do you stand on it, Jason?
Oh goodness. Give me 11.
11. Okay.
Yeah, give me 11.
And those 11 would be
all right. Let's
Maryland,
do it.
Wisconsin, Michigan State, Purdue, Michigan, Illinois, UCLA, Oregon, Nebraska, Indiana, and Ohio State? Or
you got Illinois in there? That was quick.
I think I said Illinois. Yeah.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah.
Ohio State's not going to get it. So was that 10?
That's 10. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I feel like that final game of the season between Ohio State and Indiana is going to be really crucial for both of those teams.
Well, it may not. It may not be. Ohio State would have to win at USC and beat Nebraska at home for that game to be relevant.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's the path. About a couple games ago, Ohio State didn't have to do anything crazy. They just had to beat Northwestern at home and just kind of win home games. But you talk about atmosphere at Oregon. That's been the problem with Ohio State. They have 5 1-possession losses at home this year, right? The Pitt game, they fouled a 3-point shooter twice in the last minute. And then in overtime, the Indiana game, Devin Rowe didn't play. That really hurt him. The Indiana game was just a struggle down the stretch. Oregon, they led the entire game. So there's all these chances Ohio State had. And in the end, just too many losses. They still have a path. But I think Ohio State, to legitimately feel comfortable get in, they have to win at USC, home Nebraska, and at Indiana. So I would love to see the game coming down, the Indiana game. coming down to it. Ohio State has traditionally not played very well at Assembly Hall. They're not alone. Lots of teams struggle at Assembly Hall.
Mhm.
But Ohio State matches up okay with Indiana. But they've got to get to the point where that game matters. Bryce Williams in Nebraska might have something to say about that. So
Little bit. So we got two questions here about a couple far-fetched teams. Jared asked about Penn State, and then Philip is asking about Minnesota. I've kind of written both of them off as not really a chance. Penn State does have 3 games remaining. They're all 3 quad one games though, so they could possibly get to 4-8 in quad one games. And what's that if they win 3 games, 18-13? I don't think their out of conference is strong enough though, even if they win out. What are your thoughts, Jason?
yeah, yeah, there you go. It's the 337 on conference, right? So the
Mm,
committee is going to say, don't start with a 3. Really,
yeah,
you did this. You did this to yourself. Obviously, the Big Ten plays those 2 early games before the New Year. They did a really good job. Played a great game against Purdue, won by 11. Since then, yeah, they beat Nebraska. They played really well. At Minnesota is okay, but that's about it for
yeah.
Penn State. Um, I don't really see a path on, even if they get those wins, because of their non-conference strength of schedule, and they have 13 losses. If you pick one up, that's 14. And a team with 14 losses can make the tournament. Like, absolutely. But the reality is, a team with 14 losses and a non-conference strength of schedule in the 300s never makes the tournament.
Yeah.
So in some ways, they scheduled too poorly to give themselves the benefit of the doubt on the bubble. They play really hard, right? I like Rhodes, the coach. They do a lot of good things. They've had some injuries this year. I think for a while, a lot of us had him. We're carrying him in the tournament. That Purdue win, and just when you watch them play, they're a pretty good basketball team. But the loss is just stacked up. And again, that's another environment where in the Big Ten that, like, they don't draw, and so they're just not getting the home court advantage. That's the thing about Indiana. Like, say whatever you want about Indiana, but when you go there, that place is a circus, and it's hard to win there. So even just the fan, when they're not telling, once the coach
Just
relented and
don't be
said he's
down by
gonna,
30. Yeah,
yeah,
Indiana, just don't get down by 30. You're fine.
yeah. Once they do that, but you're feeling the atmosphere effects of Ohio State and Penn State and Oregon. Some of these teams that aren't winning the home games that they possibly could, because the environment is a pretty welcoming environment for the visitors coming in. So Penn State's gonna have a hard time. Minnesota was just starting to percolate on the bubble, like just getting close and kind of hanging in there, and like, okay, we got this. Like, there's a chance. You swept USC and UCLA, which Ohio State would have sold their soul for those 2 wins.
Right.
All right. And then the Minnesota comes home and lays an egg, right, to Penn State. And Penn State played great that day, but still, I just don't see the path for Minnesota. They have some really good wins, but their metrics are a big struggle. We're in the 90s of the net ranking, and you can absorb that, but your predictive metrics are in the 80s. Like, they haven't played enough quality basketball for the entire year to justify kind of getting the benefit of the doubt. And again, that's another 329th non-conference strength of schedule, so they don't get it either. Again, there's a reason why those teams are scheduling their non-conference strength of schedule that high, because they're trying to build their program. They're trying to win. They're trying to
Right.
win games. They're trying to win games and get off to a good start. And they know in the league they're going to absorb at minimum 10 losses there. So again, it's always backwards math. And I think this is really important for fans to understand. You basically, to make the tournament, you get 14 losses. That's it. Okay. So if you have a great season in your Minnesota, you go 10-10, there's 10 there. You can only absorb, and the 14 losses includes one in the Big Ten tournament. So you only get 3 in the non-conference that you can absorb. So
Yeah.
you can't schedule that difficult and have any chance to make the tournament. So that's where these teams kind of get in trouble, that they know that they're going to struggle in the conference, and they know they got to take it easy. But then when you get towards the bubble, you don't get the benefit of the doubt, and you shouldn't. Like, you got to schedule better than that.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, keeping the sport relevant and everything like that, I think that's a really good point. And, they're going to they're going to tell you got to do it. I did think it was really interesting the way Minnesota scheduled. They had Wichita State in there, they had Yale in there, North Texas. Wake Forest isn't a great team, but they're still in the ACC. So they had some quad two games in there. So I can see what you're saying about how they're just trying to build that program, maybe get some good wins and move on from that.
Yeah,
That's
it was the
that's really good to
back
see.
end, right? There was a couple teams that scheduled they're okay, but it's like the 7 or 8 really poor games that they
Yeah.
scheduled, like all at home. They didn't really challenge themselves, and it's the back end brutal part of those quad four games that just drag down that strength of schedule.
Yeah, and I don't think they were in a tournament this year either. They were in the ESPN Worldwide Sports Complex. That was the
Yeah.
Wichita State Wake Forest. All right, let's see. What teams have we not mentioned yet? UCLA. We haven't mentioned UCLA yet. They lose to Minnesota, but then they come back. They get this win over Ohio State. Ohio State is pretty high up there in metrics, so that looks good to get that win, albeit at home, but still able to bounce back and get that one. What's your thoughts on UCLA?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit higher, a bit like Oregon. I'm a little higher in UCLA than most of the kind of the brackets coming out. Um, just to give you an idea about how hard UCLA plays. So last year they really struggled under Cronin. They were 16 and 17, right? And that's in the Pac-12, which was not a banner year in the Pac-12 last year. UCLA always guards under Cronin. Boy, do they play hard, and he's a
Mm-hmm.
he's a Patino disciple. So last year, 2-point field goal percentage, they were 341st in the country. I mean, they couldn't throw the ball in the ocean, right? And so, but they still kept playing that hard. This year, they're 119th, and their defense is almost identical. And now they're going to on their way to somewhere between 5, 6 seeds, something like that. So they play incredibly hard. If you watch the game against Ohio State yesterday, Ohio State at times couldn't get the ball in on a bounce play.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you go through the motions with kind of soft screens and things like that against UCLA, you can't get the ball in. You're using up multiple timeouts in the first half
Right.
because UCLA is just playing harder than you. We talk about Michigan can mask their turnovers. UCLA can mask at times struggling to score because Mick Cronin recruits athleticism, toughness, and guarding on defense. And so therefore, at the mercy sometimes of the ability to score. They're a little bit better offensively this year. At times, though, they can go droughts. And you saw that a little bit yesterday in the Ohio State game. But with all that said, they're the fourth best team in the country at generating turnovers. So if you can get turnovers at that rate, you can get out in transition and you can beat anybody in the country. They are a bear to play. I mean, they are really, really tough. They're really, really physical. They've won 8 of the last 10. They're playing really good basketball. And so I think that there's a path for them to get in that kind of 5 seed range. And it's tricky, right, with UCLA. When you have a team that has metrics like that is so one-sided, they're so good at one thing, they can absolutely make a Final Four. But the problem is you play in a 5-12 game and you get a Yale team who, shoots 40% from three-point line, right? And they're Yale's 8th best team in the country shooting a 3. And well, no, they're not going to try to throw the ball down on the block against UCLA, right? Some of these teams that aren't going to try to out physical you, they're just going to shoot from the perimeter and they can do that. And that's the one thing that UCLA kind of lets you do a little bit. That's where they could get in trouble, getting in kind of a scoring match when teams make shots. But all in all, UCLA is probably in that 5-6 seed range, and they're playing fantastic. Cronin's a really good coach.
Yeah, that's what I thought was so interesting about that UCLA Ohio State game is I thought that gave Ohio State the opportunity to bounce back from that Northwestern game because Ohio State doesn't have great down low presence, but boy can they shoot. The problem is they can also not shoot
Yeah.
sometimes, and Junie Mobley has not been himself recently. I don't know if he's sick or whatever, and that's been a struggle for him. So. But we've talked enough about Ohio State. We don't need to get back to them. Purdue. Let's talk a little bit of Purdue.
Yeah.
So Purdue 7-8 quad one games. They're 7-1 in quad two games. They were having a really nice season. Number one in the Big Ten at one point. I thought they were going to win the Big Ten again. I thought it was going to be closer, but I thought they were going to win it again. But now they've lost 4 games in a row. Mostly recently the loss to Indiana. They have a terrible stretch to end the season. And I said it on one of our episodes. I said at Michigan, Wisconsin, at Michigan State, at Indiana. Then you have UCLA, Rutgers, which Rutgers is not looking good this season, but they still have 2 lottery picks on that team. And you put up, Purdue's on-ball defense and perimeter defense out there. Like, that's tough for them. And then you finish the season with at Illinois, a team that could be desperate for a win at that point if they lose to both Michigan and Iowa. I mean, what's your thoughts here on Purdue? Obviously, they're going to make the tournament. They're not in danger of that. But, I mean, let's say Purdue just loses out here the last 3 games. How far down low could their seed line drop?
They're probably not going much past the 6 line. They just have too many good wins. So
Yeah.
even if the bottom falls out, they probably don't get past the 6 line.
Okay.
The the issue with Purdue is really simple. They can't guard right now.
Yeah.
Like they're not guarding, especially for a Matt Painter team. Their defensive metrics are absurd. They're 336 in the country at 2-point field goal percentage defense. Like that's, I mean, they're usually in the top 20. Like they're 300 in some spots behind where they usually are. Since February 1st, they're dead last in the country. Dead last in the country. They pick a team, right? Pick a team in the Sun Belt. Like it doesn't matter. They're the worst team in the country at field goal percentage in 2-point field goal percentage since February 1st by 5 percentage points.
Oh my gosh.
So when you step back and take a look, it doesn't, in some ways, if you're a Purdue fan, it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter what seed you are, you've got to work on fixing some defensive things. Listen, they're sacrificing some defense for offense. So you saw it in the first half of the Indiana game. Wren and Braden Smith, when these guys get going, they are fantastic. They can really, really score. 11th best offense in the country. But when they start missing some shots and teams get out in transition, they're not overly athletic this year. And they're sacrificing some of their defense for offense. And everybody talks about how good Zach Edey was on the offensive end. Sweet. The issue was he also helped them inside. Lawyer and Smith are fantastic college basketball players, but they're not great defensively, right? And when athletic guards can get by them at times, Edey's not there to turn the ball away or to even just mentally turn people away. I'm not going to go in there. I'm not going to mess with that. They don't have the inside presence to keep the ball out of the lane. So teams are just getting to the block. They're getting inside. They're getting and ones, and they're just taking advantage of them inside. So they've got to get that fixed. Offensively, they're fine. They're great. If you haven't watched them, Braden Smith's one of the best passers. He's like a generationally good passer. Like you want to teach someone how to play basketball and be unselfish. Like you got to watch Purdue offensively. Close your eyes right now on defense, but watch them play offense. With all that kidding aside, like Purdue still has a path to a good tournament run because they can keep scoring. Because they have one of the top 5 coaches in the country. They'll figure out kind of how to navigate it. They're so proud that kind of playing a matchup zone or something like that just isn't in their DNA, right? Like they're so proud in those things. So you're not going to see a ton of those things. But they're going to have to get creative with how they start matching up defensively because they got to fix something. They can't keep. I mean, if you saw the second half when Indiana was on a 30-5 run, they just couldn't get the ball in the lane. And Indiana has the ability with Diallo and some of those guys inside to take advantage of them, and that's what they did. Even in the first half, I said to myself watching the game, and Indiana was down 12. Indiana's better players right now.
Yeah.
So Purdue really couldn't stop, and Purdue just was making everything. Once Purdue slowed down and they couldn't get the shots they wanted, Indiana took advantage of them inside. They're fine. They'll win their games at home probably. They're okay. They'll probably end up, around that 5 seed line, probably no worse than a 6. But really for them, it's not about the seed. It's about kind of getting some things fixed and get rolling as you get in the NCAA tournament.
So what would you say, and I know you said it's not so much about the seed, but I am curious with kind of some of your thought process there, because it sounds like they're more likely to win some of these games with 2 home games. Let's say they went out. Let's say they beat UCLA, they beat Rutgers, and they get the win at Illinois. How high do you think that seed could get? 4, 5 maybe?
UCLA, Illinois, it depends. Early Big Ten, if you win the 1-8 game, and then if they give you credit for your semifinal game in the Big Ten, you get a little bit of credit for that. There's probably a path to the back end of the 3 line for Purdue.
Okay.
there's still a path there. It's just the sheer quality of wins. Their non-conference strength of schedules in the top 10. Their overall strength of schedules in the top 10. So they're strong there. They beat Bama. They got the Maryland win. They're pretty good on the road. Their home loss to Ohio State's the only thing outside of quadrant 1 that's a quad 2 loss, and it's just on the cusp of that. So I think what kind of nice neutral court over Ole Miss and San Diego. Probably the back end of the 3 line, because their schedule's so hard and they've done so well. And the committee rewards that. The committee looks back and says, like, whoa, these guys have played people. And they still, they'd be up around that 10, 12 range of quad 1 wins. So back end of the 3, top of the 4. Yeah.
It's interesting. That's a gamble, right? Purdue did that, and now they're, going to be probably somewhere around 20, 21 and 10 or 20,
Yeah.
22 and 9 or something like that. And they're going to get rewarded for it. And, as we talked about with Ohio State, they just scheduled too hard for where they were as a program right now. And they're going to lose out for it because they're probably going to have more than 14 losses. So, all right. So, any sleeper teams, like any teams that maybe aren't getting mentioned right now? We talked a little bit about Penn State, Minnesota. USC was getting some love at one point,
Yeah.
but they have really started to fall off. I know Northwestern has a high net ranking, but with them being 14 and 13, I'm not really sure I can see it. Is there any chance of a sleeper team that is maybe below Indiana right now that you're like, they have a path? It's unlikely, but there's a path there to possibly get in.
Well, I don't know that they don't really have a path to get in, but a team that can be wildly entertaining in the Big Ten tournament is Rutgers,
Yeah,
right? When you have Harper and Bailey and your two best players, your two best players are freshmen. By the end of the year, they're not freshmen anymore.
right.
Um, the issue is always going to be, and at the preseason Big Ten Media Day, there was so much hype around Rutgers, right? And the issue is this: in this day and age with the portal, you've got to have grown men playing basketball. Now, keep in mind, Bailey and Harper are fantastic. They are fantastic, and they are wonderful players. My issue is not that they're not grown men. You got to have grown men around them to support them. For example, Patino has already said, I'm not recruiting any freshmen next year.
Hmm.
I'm just going to rebuild a roster, right?
Wow.
So a lot of coaches are going away from recruiting freshmen because by the time you develop them into good players, I'm going to go one more Ohio State reference tonight. Felix Akpara started 2 years at Ohio State, right? So this year was the year he was going to turn into a fantastic player. He starts for Tennessee.
Yeah.
Roddy Gale, we watched him turn the ball over consistently for 2 years in a row at Ohio State. Now he's the key piece at Michigan. So you don't get any credit for grooming people to become good players and going through the freshman and sophomore struggles. You just got to win because you're not around long enough to absorb 3 seasons of not making the tournament at these programs. Getting back to Rutgers, they didn't insulate them with enough kind of experience and really good players, right? They lost their big guy, to Bama, and they've struggled since protecting the paint inside. But they're wildly entertaining, and on a neutral court, they could be a major issue. If those guys get hot, they could be really entertaining. They're one of those teams you look back and like Rutgers could be playing on CBS on Saturday in the semis. They might be out of gas by then, but they could absolutely get there.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. All right, let's do one thing because I know, I mean, at least for me, I pay attention the most to the Big Ten. That's where I'm at all the time. I mean, I'm checking in on other things, SEC, Big East, sometimes stuff like that. But for the most part, I'm all Big Ten. So if I'm a fan of Nebraska, Indiana, Ohio State, kind of on the bubble or near the bubble teams right now, what other teams in the nation should I be paying attention to? Maybe rooting against them just to help my team out a little bit more.
Yeah, you want to root against Oklahoma. Oklahoma started the year really, really good. They were 13-0 in the non-conference, but they're 4-10 or so in the league. Now, your conference record is not on the NCAA team sheets, but it's pretty apparent, how many losses they've taken on lately. So you want to root against Oklahoma. You want to root against Xavier. You want to root against Wake Forest. You want to root against Arkansas and Texas. Right, that's probably a good place to start. A team that I think absolutely might find their way to get in is like a Boise State. They're probably they keep winning in the Mountain West, and the Mountain West is quality enough conference. They might get 3 bids, so you'd probably root against them. So Xavier, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas, although one of those two teams will probably get in. That it's kind of the back end of the bubble. The reality is once you get inside of that, most of those teams are pretty much insulated and locked in. Maybe Vanderbilt could find a path to not get in. One of the teams that everybody just writes them on the 8 or 9 line is Baylor. Like they don't have a resume to be that good, but they're Gonzaga and Baylor. I'm just going to go on my rant here. Gonzaga and Baylor are getting the benefit of the doubt in a lot of brackets when the reality is if people took time to look at what they've done this year, they should not have a single digit seed. Like there just isn't really a path there. The problem is once you get to the back end of the 9 line, there's no one to put there. And so like Gonzaga or Baylor or VCU, like Drake, one of these teams is going to get a 9 seed, which is crazy town. So right now Gonzaga occupies it. There's a path. If Gonzaga goes to Santa Clara, San Francisco, if they lose those 2 games this week, there's a path where you could look at Gonzaga and say, should they make the tournament? Which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, for sure. John also brings up UNC. Are they out completely at this point? They still on the bubble?
No, you're right, John. You're right. You would want to root against UNC. There's a path towards them just kind of gobbling up wins. Gobbling up wins if they somehow would beat Duke and get hot like they did last year. But yeah, UNC could get in just on they're going to be over 4 games over 500, and they don't have any losses outside of quadrant 1. Yeah, so you'd want to root against Cincinnati. Against George Mason, against UNC. There's some crazy scenario where Villanova could get in. Like there's kind of periphery teams. You go to my website, you kind of look at the first 4 out, next 4 out, and in the hunt, like kind of go through the last 4 in, and just start rooting against all of them. But there's a lot of SEC teams kind of bunched up. I just feel like there's going to find a path for Xavier to get in because their record's going to be really good. The Big East is down, but they're going to get more bids than last year. So you figure that one out. And probably a Wake or a UNC team is probably going to get in because these SEC teams and the Big Ten teams just keep bumping heads, right, and just beating the mess out of each other. So,
yeah, that's really interesting. So my co-host for the Power Rankings show, his name's Casual Big Ten, Kent. He says, "What does Washington have to do to make the tournament?" I'll let you guys decide which tournament I'm talking about. How far off are we from Big Ten tournament bracketologists? Because 3 teams don't make the Big Ten tournament.
I know.
Now, Jason.
I know. Yeah, they're in trouble for that. At 4-12, it's not looking good. They'd have to win out. They would need help from USC and Iowa and Minnesota. So probably not.
Yeah,
That's
kind of what we said on the Power Ranking show too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a very clean path. It is kind of disheartening, right? The kind of one of the beauties of conference tournaments where like even if you struggled, you still had kind of this hope of you keep improving, we still have a chance. And now the conferences, just for those listening that aren't familiar with it, in the Big Ten, there are 3 Big Ten teams that will not participate in the Big Ten tournament in Indianapolis in a couple of weeks. So they won't go. So they're done early. I also think it's good experience for these players, right? Like
right.
There's just something about it and participating in it. And, I've been fortunate to be there. There's something about it that is really awesome. And it's kind of disheartening that the leagues are so big that they can't absorb it. Like, what the heck, man? Like, make them play 2 that day, but everybody gets to go. Like, make them play 2. Play the morning, play the night game, play and be the end caps to the day, but give it a go. Like that's your punishment. You got to give it a go twice that day. They're making money now. They should be able to do it.
Well, that's what I was gonna say too. Was like the TV can make more money off that, more games. You'd think they'd be all for. Hey, yeah, sure, we'll take a play-in game for the Big Ten tournament or something.
Yeah, make them play at noon and then have them play at 8:30.
There you go. There you go. Jared asked which 3 teams will not make the Big Ten tournament. We talked about it on the Power Rankings episode. I think Washington and Penn State are probably out for sure. Penn State obviously could help themselves by winning a few of those games. Northwestern's actually the most interesting one to watch because Northwestern does play Iowa and Minnesota next, and Iowa and Minnesota are both sitting at 6-10, and Northwestern is at 5-11. So
I gotta be very honest. I do a lot of prep work for these. I did not prep the tiebreaker between Northwestern and Iowa. So I do have to look at that. So I'm sorry.
There we go.
I
We've
am
given you
look.
more work to do there, Jason.
Yeah. They get Iowa, UCLA at home, Minnesota on the road. Maybe. I still think Iowa probably still finds a path to get in. Let me look at Iowa's finish here. Oh boy, Iowa's got 3 out of 4 on the road. They got to get, like you said, at Illinois, at Northwestern, Michigan State at home, at Nebraska. Good luck. Yeah, Northwestern might be able to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Northwestern might be able to get in. That's a tough finish for Iowa. That's a
Yeah.
really tough finish for Iowa. So let's just go with Washington, Penn State, and Iowa don't make it.
All
We'll
right.
put Northwestern in. Chris Collins.
There you go. I need I heard somebody the other day called Nick Martinelli like the off-brand Larry Bird. So if I can watch the off-brand Larry Bird play some more, that's what I want to see. So
That's right. That's
all
right.
right, everybody. Hey, we really appreciate Jason being here, and we really appreciate everybody in the chat and everybody who, if you're listening to this after the fact on the podcast, Jason, why don't you tell people where they can find your work one more time?
Yeah, you can find me at Big Underdog and on Twitter at Big Underdog Blog, and then find some of my written work on busting brackets.
There you go. Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you, Jason, for coming in and listening to all of our questions, whether they were NCAA tournament related or Big Ten tournament related. And we gave you some more work to do, so
All right,
we'll
sounds
consider
good.
that a win.
Sounds good. Thanks,
All right,
JR. Be
everybody.
well.
No problem. You too. Hey, everybody. We will see you tomorrow night for a Big Ten football episode with me and Zach. No Big Ten after dark after that. That was a lot to do last Sunday. So we're going to go ahead and nix that, but we're going to try to have something back for you Wednesday night, Big Ten after dark. So thanks so much for being here. Thank you to Jason. Thank you, everybody who listened.